Continue, continue. There's no future for the people of Europe other than in union.
Décision de ce premier exécutif européen, c'est là une des transformations essentielles.
Others became famous for their ideas that were actually his. Just a former cognac dealer in a plain suit. A strategist, a negotiator. The man who united Europe without ever holding elected office, persuading leaders who rarely agreed on anything. From the shadows, he shaped decisions that would change the course of Europe. In the darkest years of the 20th century, Jean Monnet built the blueprint for a Europe that could stand together and stay together. This is the story of Jean Monnet, the quiet architect of European unity.
C'est une réalité vivante. C'est le commencement de l'Europe.
Welcome to the EU Made Simple series, our founding European fathers and mothers, where we uncover the lives of the boldest minds behind the European Union. And in our second episode, we turn to the Frenchman, Jean Monnet, a man of action with arguably the greatest network and diplomacy skills of his time. Cognac, France, 1888. Jean Monnet is born above the family's cognac warehouse, where the air is thick with the scent of oak barrels and aging liquor. His father runs the business, and his mother keeps the accounts. And it isn't politics that shape young Jean, it's trade. Ships loading at the docks, orders bound for Canada, conversations about harvest in France, and customers across the oceans. In 1904, at 16, Monnet, eager to join the business, quit school with his father's blessing and boarded a train to London to work for the family's cognac business. The city was the beating heart of global trade. Ships in the Thames unloading goods from every corner of the empire. Deals struck over long lunches in smoke-filled offices. Jean started learning his trade, and 2 years later, in 1906, he crossed the Atlantic to Canada to represent the family with the Hudson Bula Company, their main agents in North America. For an 18-year-old from Cognac, this was another world entirely. Raw, restless, full of opportunity. He was negotiating shipments, solving disputes, and discovering that in America, chaos and progress could exist side by side. It left him with a lasting conviction. Europe's old rigid systems were destined to break, unless they learned to change. From London's docks to Canada's open frontier, Monnet came away with a truth that would guide him for the rest of his life. Deals weren't just about numbers on a page, they were about trust between people. And if you could earn that trust, you could get things done. But what truly shaped Jean Monnet was World War I. In the summer of 1914, fresh from his travels in Canada, he stood at the station in Cognac and watched as trains full of young French men rolled out, cheering, waving flags, and singing La Marseillaise. They were heading to the front to fight the Germans. They thought they were off to glory, but Monnet knew better. He understood that this war would be long, brutal, and costly, and that France was unprepared. The thought haunted him, and it pushed him to act. From his home in Cognac, he boarded a train to Bordeaux, where the French government had fled as German forces advanced on Paris. Not to see friends, not to trade brandy, but to speak to the Prime Minister of France, René Viviani. I mean, just imagine that, a 26-year-old with the audacity to walk in and tell the head of government that France had no real plan for victory, and the only hope was to work closely and urgently with Great Britain. So surely this bold move failed, right? Who on earth would listen to him? Well, this is probably the most remarkable part of his story. He did it. Thanks to a connection through a Cognac friend, Monnet secured a meeting with Viviani. And in the meeting, he argued for coordination of maritime logistics with the British, for the sharing of resources and aligning military strategy, and for putting unity above nationalism. And Viviani listened, and he was impressed. So impressed that before long, Monnet was on another train, bound for London once again, tasked with a mission to set up a joint Franco-British body to coordinate shipping, coal, steel, and other essential supplies. And he did just that. In late 1914 and 1915, Monnet helped establish the Allied Maritime Transport Council, which became the central body at managing merchant ships for the war effort. His work impressed both French and British leaders, and it was his first real proof that cooperation between nations could work in practice, not just as an idea. Monnet's success in London did not go unnoticed. By the end of the war, he had a reputation as the man who could get rivals to work together and make it look effortless. In 1919, as the world's leaders gathered in Paris to shape the post-war order, Monnet joined the French delegation. And once again, he had an idea. Instead of crushing Germany with debt it could never repay, why not issue an international loan to rebuild Europe with the Germans as partners? For him, helping Germany was in everyone's interest. It was a bold, unpopular view at the time, and as we know today, it did not make it into the Treaty of Versailles. But across the table, US President Woodrow Wilson had at least one proposal in the same spirit: a permanent international organization to prevent future wars, the League of Nations. Based in Geneva, it would handle border disputes, refugee crises, even pandemics like the Spanish flu. Exactly the kind of challenge that needed a doer like Jean Monnet. And so, at 31, he became the Deputy Secretary General of the League, one of the youngest in history. Suddenly, he was helping run a completely new kind of institution, unlike anything the world had ever seen before. But there was a flaw. First, Wilson's United States could not convince its own people to join the club. And second, the League could act only when all of its members agreed. You know, unanimity, something we know all too well in the European Union today. By 1923, Monnet left the League of Nations to rescue his father's struggling business, hit hard by prohibition in the United States. Through his network of international banks, he secured financing and soon rose to the vice president of one of America's largest banks. He made a fortune, until the crash in 1929 wiped much of it out. Restless, Monnet returned to the League in 1932, this time as an advisor to the Chinese government, tasked with reorganizing the railways and stabilizing the economy. China confirmed what he already believed. Trust was the most valuable currency, and building it across cultures was his greatest skill. And then came World War II. By 1940, Monnet had spent decades building connections. In banks, boardrooms, in the corridors of power. So when France collapsed under the German invasion, he was already on speaking terms with Winston Churchill. Churchill had a mission for him: convince the Americans, still officially neutral, to prepare for war. Build the military industry they would need. And above all, build planes. Thousands of them. Monnet moved to Washington and began working with the people who had the ear of the president. And through them, he gained access to the White House, to Franklin Roosevelt himself. He visited Roosevelt often, always bringing concrete proposals. And one day, he arrived with a single piece of paper, a balance sheet showing exactly how many planes were needed to defeat Hitler, and how quickly the American industry could produce them. Roosevelt studied it, liked what he saw, and soon US aircraft production began to rise on a scale the world had never seen before. Monnet's success in Washington opened a new chapter, this time in Algiers, French Algeria. By early 1943, after the Allied landings in North Africa, Algiers had become the base for Free French forces preparing to return home. But the resistance was fractured. De Gaulle led one camp, Giroud another, and leaders across the empire each had their own loyalties. They all wanted to defeat Germany, but not on what France should look like after liberation. The mistrust ran super deep. For Churchill and Roosevelt, this disunity was dangerous. It could weaken the Free French cause and throw post-war France into chaos. They needed a mediator. And guess who they turned to? They, of course, turned to Jean Monnet. Monnet was sent to Algiers with one mission: bring the rival French factions together and turn them into a single authority. And this is exactly what he did. He helped establish the French Committee of National Liberation, headquartered in the city. And this was not another wartime office. It meant to be the government in waiting for a free France, ready to take over the moment the Germans were driven out. But the committee was fragile. Monnet spent his days brokering compromises between Gaullists and Giroudists, calming disputes before they exploded, and making sure the committee could speak with one voice to the Allies. He coordinated with British and American commanders on how liberated territories would be governed, and he began outlining the structure of a post-war French administration that could restore democracy quickly. And this was a turning point for Monnet. From Algiers, looking at the chaos of war and rivalries tearing Europe apart, the future became clear to him. A new Europe was needed. Here, Jean Monnet's concrete ideas of a united Europe took shape. France's existence, especially alongside a resurgent Germany, could only be secure if both nations were bound together inside something greater than the nation-state. That meant transferring part of each state's sovereignty to an international union, a union with real powers to pool production, manage shared markets for key industries, and stand firmly against the forces of nationalism that had twice plunged the continent into war. When the war ended and Germany was defeated, Charles de Gaulle led the provisional government of France. Monnet, though, drawing on the trust and rapport he had built with Charles de Gaulle in Algiers, positioned himself as the man who could deliver France's recovery. Impressed by Monnet's diplomatic skills and talent for negotiation, de Gaulle appointed him as the head of the General Planning Commission, tasked with nothing less than rebuilding the nation's economy. And from this, Monnet went to work, launching what became known as the Monnet Plan, a bold program to modernize the French industry.
La France est maintenant à la croisée des chemins. Si elle s'engage délibérément dans la voie de la modernisation, elle peut augmenter très rapidement sa capacité de production et sa productivité.
It focused on rebuilding and modernizing France's economy, especially coal and steel production, to make the country competitive again. But to make it work, France needed coal. And not just any coal, Ruhr and Saar coal, deep inside West Germany. And this meant problems, lots of them. The Ruhr was under Allied control. Britain and the United States wanted to rebuild West Germany as quickly as possible, to stand as a barrier against the Soviet Union. France, though, scarred by 2 German invasions in 30 years, wanted the exact opposite, to keep German heavy industry under tight control. And the Saar was a coal-rich region right on the French-German border. France administered it as a protectorate and used its coal to refuel reconstruction. West Germany, on the other hand, considered it part of their own country and saw French control as a national humiliation. By early 1950, these tensions are reaching a breaking point. Monnet saw his moment. Coal and steel were the lifeblood of modern warfare, the raw materials for tanks, ships, and guns. If Germany and France controlled them together, war between them would not just be unthinkable, it would be materially impossible. So, in strict secrecy, Monnet and a small team at the General Planning Commission began drafting a proposal for a European coal and steel community. A single independent authority that would control coal and steel production for France, Germany, and any other country willing to join. And at the same time, it was a model for a future united Europe. Monnet now needed an ally who could make this plan public. And that man was no other than Robert Schuman, France's foreign minister at the time. Schuman understood immediately. This would bind France and Germany so closely together that war would be impossible. He agreed to take it forward, but in secrecy, until the day of the announcement. The team was perfect. Monnet was the architect working in the shadows, and Schuman the politician carrying it into the spotlight. Next came West Germany. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, eager to prove his new republic could be trusted, welcomed the idea. For him, joining the plan was a way to regain sovereignty and respect on the world stage. Italy also followed quickly, seeing economic opportunity and a path into Europe's inner circle. Then Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg also joined, small countries that understood the value of having a seat at the same table as the big powers. And so, in just weeks, the foundations were laid. 6 nations, 1 proposal, and a date, the 9th of May 1950, the day Robert Schuman stepped in front of the cameras and announced a plan that would change Europe forever.
L'Europe n'a pas été faite, nous avons eu la guerre. L'Europe ne se fera pas d'un coup, ni dans une construction d'ensemble. Elle se fera par des réalisations concrètes créant d'abord une solidarité de fait.
The Schuman Plan was signed by all 6 states on the 18th of April in 1951. It became the blueprint of the European Union that we know today.
Nous tous, Allemands, Belges, Français, Hollandais, Italiens et Luxembourgeois, devenons Européens.
The European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, the European Commission, even the European Court of Justice, all of them were already in Monnet's long-term vision, but the coal and steel community was the first stone. And since the Second World War, no wars have been fought between EU members. This surely was the biggest reason why. But while the coal and steel community was Monnet's greatest success, what followed was his greatest disappointment. He believed the next step in Europe's integration should be a shared army to guarantee real European security. Monnet lobbied quietly but relentlessly, convincing the US president, winning over West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, and securing agreement from all participating parliaments. All except one. His own, France. When the French National Assembly voted, it failed to reach a majority. The rejection landed like a bombshell, threatening to derail the entire European project. For Monnet, it was a super bitter defeat, and in 1955, he resigned as president of the coal and steel community's high authority. But Monnet wasn't done dreaming. Retreating from official posts, he began working on a new idea, the United States of Europe. He founded the Action Committee for the United States of Europe, a coalition of politicians, trade unionists, and business leaders from across the continent. Its mission was simple: keep pushing governments towards deeper integration. The committee became an informal but powerful driver of European policy. It supported the creation of the European Economic Community and Euratom in the 1957 Treaties of Rome, and kept pressing for enlargement, bringing new members into the European project. Jean Monnet didn't live to see how far the European project would go. The single market, the euro, or a union of nearly 30 states. As in March 1979, at the age of 90, he died in Rougaré in France. It was a year with heavy symbolism. Just months after his death, Europeans went to the polls to directly elect the European Parliament for the very first time, an institution Monnet had envisioned decades earlier. His death was quiet. There was no grand political office to leave behind, no farewell speech from a presidential palace. And yet, for those who understood the struggle for European unity, it was the loss of arguably the most important architect. Monnet had spent more than half a century working, not for power, not for office, but for an idea that Europe's nations could rise above their rivalries and share their destiny. From the shadows, he proved that you didn't need to be a politician to shape politics, that a network, patience, and persuasion could be as powerful as armies. His final resting place is in the Pantheon in Paris, among France's national heroes. A fitting place for a man who, without ever leading a government, helped change the fate of an entire continent. But this story still continues. In 2025, the Monnet Action Committee was relaunched with a new generation of European leaders and thinkers, including personalities like Josep Borrell, Guy Verhofstadt, Mario Monti, and Klaus Welle, all committed to completing the Union in a real European foundation. This video was sponsored by the Union of European Federalists, a pan-European organization founded in 1946 to promote a democratic and united Europe. Spinelli was one of its founders, and he fought for that very vision, although he initially did disagree somewhat with Monnet. You see, Jean Monnet believed that Europe should be built step by step, through practical projects like the coal and steel community. This gradualist method aimed to unite countries by cooperating on specific issues. Spinelli and other Federalists, on the other hand, wanted a democratic process to create a true European federation, not just coordination between governments that kept their veto powers. Over time, though, Federalists came to see that both ideas could work together, gradual steps could lead to deeper unity, as long as people stayed engaged and pushed for a more democratic Europe. This is the second episode in our series on the founding fathers and mothers of the European Union. If you haven't seen the first one yet, check it out to learn about Altiero Spinelli, the visionary prisoner with no army, no country, and no freedom, who dared to imagine a united federal Europe. And in episode 3 and beyond, we'll explore the stories of Konrad Adenauer, Louisa Weiss, and Robert Schuman, so make sure you subscribe. And to support this work and help us to keep producing independent EU-focused content, please consider joining us on Patreon. And a huge thank you to our presidents, Jan Schauke, Christian Peter, AGVD, Daniel Unite Europe, Stefan Rashid, and Kiki Loxon. Your support makes all of this possible.